My parents spent everything on my brother. Then grandfather's accountant read the file. Hi, everyone. My name is Clara Whitfield. I'm 29 years old. For 22 years, I ironed my brother's shirts, wrote his school reports, covered his debts, and smiled in the background of every family achievement while my parents told anyone who would listen that Daniel was the one going somewhere. And the first time any adult in that family ever treated my name like it belonged at the center of a room was the morning my grandfather's accountant spread a manila folder across a conference table, looked at my father and said, "Did you know about all of this? Or just some of it?" My father's answer told me everything. He didn't say no. He said, "That's not relevant." It was very relevant, but we'll get to that. The truth is, that conference table was not the beginning of the story. Before I continue the story, I'd like to ask you, my dear listeners, to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It truly inspires me to create even more captivating stories for you. The beginning was a kitchen, 22 years earlier, when I was 7 years old, and my mother handed me a dish towel before I had finished eating my own breakfast, because Daniel had knocked over his orange juice and someone needed to clean it up, and Daniel, who was 9, was already considered too important for wet floors. I dried the floor. He went back to his cereal. My mother called me her little helper and meant it as a compliment. I didn't know yet that helper was a cage built to sound like praise. Daniel was 9 when I was 7, and from the very beginning, the gap between us was not measured in years. It was measured in what each of us was expected to carry. The clearest version of this I can give you is a single ordinary morning when I was 11. It was a school day. Daniel had overslept, which was a thing he did with the confidence of someone who had always had someone else to catch the consequences. My mother had already left for work. My father was in the shower. I was downstairs making toast when Daniel came thundering down the stairs 15 minutes before the bus, and he looked at me, not panicked, just expectant, and said, "Can you make my lunch?" I made his lunch. I also finished my own breakfast, found his PE kit, wrote a note to his form teacher explaining that his homework was late because he had been unwell last week, which was not entirely true but was the version my mother used and had apparently delegated to me, and then I got us both to the bus stop with 3 minutes to spare. At school that day, I got a commendation in English. I didn't tell anyone when I got home. There was dinner to start. That is the texture of it. Not cruelty. Not drama. Just a consistent direction in which attention and effort were expected to flow toward Daniel, managed by me, noted by no one. My brother carried potential. He carried the family name forward. He carried my father's ambition and my mother's pride and the particular brightness that parents pour into a son when they have decided, before he has done a single thing to earn it, that he is the one the world will reward. I carried everything else. I don't mean that as metaphor. I mean it in the plain, daily, exhausting sense. I carried the grocery bags from the car. I carried the laundry basket up 2 flights of stairs. I carried the responsibility of keeping the house running while my mother worked late and my father coached Daniel's soccer team on Thursday evenings, and nobody thought to ask whether I had homework due Friday or whether I had eaten since lunch. By the time I was 10, I knew how to make spaghetti from scratch, how to decale the bathroom tiles with white vinegar, how to fold a fitted sheet so it didn't take up extra space in the linen cupboard. I knew these things not because anyone taught me with care or patience, but because I had learned that if I didn't know them, the work simply didn't get done, and if the work didn't get done, my mother would come home and say, with that quiet, disappointed voice that was somehow worse than shouting, "I thought you were old enough to handle this, Clara." Old enough. That phrase followed me the way weather follows coast. I was old enough to handle the dishes, but not old enough to choose what we had for dinner. Old enough to watch Daniel in the evenings, but not old enough to have somewhere else to be. Old enough to manage the household, but somehow never old enough to be asked whether I was okay. Daniel, meanwhile, was never old enough for anything inconvenient. He was too young to do the dishes because he needed to rest before practice. He was too stressed about exams to help with the shopping. He was too busy with his social life to come home before dark, which meant I was the one who stayed, the one who covered, the one who smiled when relatives came over and asked how Daniel was getting on, and quietly set another place at the table when no one was looking. My parents did not think of themselves as unfair people. That is the part one spent years failing to explain to the few friends I told about it. There were no dramatic scenes most of the time, no visible cruelty you could point to on a particular Tuesday afternoon and say, that is where it happened. That is the wound. It was quieter than that. It was 1,000 small assumptions, made daily, without examination. My mother assumed I would help, because I was good at helping. My father assumed the house would function because houses function. Daniel assumed someone would handle everything, because someone always had. And I assumed for a very long time that this was simply how families worked. Grandfather saw it differently. My grandfather, Harold Whitfield, was my father's father. He was a compact, serious man who had built a small but careful financial consulting firm over 40 years and retired at 72 with the particular dignity of someone who had never once confused being liked with being right. He lived 40 minutes away, in a house that smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and he called on Sunday afternoons, every week without fail, and asked how I was doing in a tone that suggested he actually wanted to know. He was not a warm man in the conventional sense. He did not hug easily or speak in the soft, reassuring language of modern affection. But he paid attention. That was his version of love, paying close, careful, unflinching attention. I noticed it first when I was 12. We were at a family dinner at his house, the kind with good china and extra chairs brought in from the hallway, and my mother asked me to serve the vegetables while everyone else sat down. I did it without thinking. I had been doing it so long it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like gravity. But grandfather was watching. He didn't say anything that evening. He just watched. The way he watched clients when he was still working, I found out years later. Quietly. Building a picture. The second time I noticed it was when I was 15. My parents were discussing Daniel's summer program, something competitive and expensive that required filling out applications and arranging transport, and the conversation took up most of a Sunday visit without once turning toward me or what I was doing that summer, which was, as it turned out, babysitting my cousin's children on alternating weekdays because my aunt needed help and my mother had volunteered me without consulting me. Grandfather asked, near the end of the afternoon, very casually, whether I had made any plans for summer. My mother said, "Oh, Clara's very helpful with the cousins." Grandfather looked at her for a moment. "I didn't ask about the cousins," he said. The sentence dropped like a stone into still water. Nobody acknowledged the ripple. My mother changed the subject. My father started talking about Daniel's application. But I sat there with grandfather's gaze still warm on the side of my face and thought, he saw that. He actually saw that. After that, he started calling me separately from the Sunday calls. Small things at first. He'd ask if I wanted to come by and help him sort through some old books. Or he'd say he'd found a film I might like, and would I want to watch it on Saturday. My mother always agreed to these invitations with the cheerful ease of someone who has temporarily outsourced an obligation, and I always went, and in those Saturday afternoons at his kitchen table, drinking the terrible strong tea he made and talking about things that had nothing to do with anyone else in my family, I learned what it felt like to be in a room where no one needed anything from me. He never said directly, "I see what they're doing." He was not a man who named things dramatically. But once, when I was 17 and had come over looking hollowed out from a particularly bad week in which I had failed a French exam because I'd spent 3 evenings helping Daniel prepare for a presentation he then delivered without crediting my contribution, grandfather set his tea down and said, "You know, Clara, the people who carry the most in a family are almost never the ones who get thanked for it." I said I was fine. He looked at me the way he always looked at people he thought were lying to themselves. "I know," he said. "That's not what I asked." I didn't say anything after that. But I didn't have to. He had already said enough. I want to tell you about one specific afternoon, because it is the one I come back to most often when I think about how patterns become invisible from the inside. I was 19. It was a Saturday in November, the kind of gray, damp Saturday, where staying indoors feels like a reasonable response to the world. Daniel had a match that day, an away fixture, and my parents had driven him to it and stayed to watch. They had asked me, the previous evening, whether I wanted to come along. But they'd asked it in the way they always asked, at the end of a conversation about logistics, after it had already been established that someone needed to stay home to receive a delivery, Len the plumber who was coming to look at the boiler, and start the dinner early because they'd be home late and hungry. I said I would stay home. My mother said that was so helpful, Clara. I received the delivery. I let in the plumber. I started the dinner. While I was peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink, I looked out of the window at the wet street below and thought, for the first time with real clarity, I did not agree to this. I was presented with it already assembled, and then thanked for fitting into it. The thought was not angry. That is the part one finds strange to describe now. It was just clear. The way something looks different when the light in a room finally comes on, and you realize you had been navigating by half-darkness so long that you had stopped noticing. I put the potato down. I stood at the sink. I let myself feel the thing I had been trained not to feel, which was not resentment. Not exactly, but something simpler and more foundational. The recognition that I was tired, that I had been tired for a very long time, and that no one in that house had ever thought to ask. I picked the potato back up. I finished peeling. I made the dinner. That is how you live in those systems, when you have been built for them. You have the thought. You feel the thing. And then you pick the potato back up, because the alternative is a conversation you have not yet worked out how to have, and the dinner still needs to be made, and your family will be hungry when they come home. I did not call grandfather that evening, but I thought about calling him, which was its own kind of conversation, conducted silently, with someone 40 minutes away who I was fairly certain already knew. Then, 2 winters ago, grandfather had a stroke. It was minor as strokes go, in the sense that he recovered his speech and most of his mobility within 6 weeks. But it was major in every way that counted because it made him reorganize things. His firm was already wound down. His affairs were already in reasonable order. But a health event has a way of making people precise about what they want to happen after. He called Mr. Aldrich, his accountant of 23 years, and told him to update everything. I didn't know any of this at the time. What I knew was that grandfather was in hospital and then at home recovering, and that my parents visited twice during his hospital stay and once during his recovery, and both times my mother spent most of the visit telling grandfather about Daniel's new job, and my father spent most of it talking about a renovation project, and at no point did either of them ask grandfather whether he was scared or in pain or what he needed. I was there 6 times in the first 2 weeks. More after that. I brought him the particular brand of digestive biscuits he liked and could only find at one shop 40 minutes from my flat. I sat with him through the long, flat afternoons when the television felt like noise and he didn't have the energy for books yet. I helped him with the physiotherapy exercises his doctors had prescribed, standing beside his chair and counting repetitions with the kind of patient steadiness I had spent my whole childhood developing without knowing what it would eventually be used for. 3 weeks before he died, he was well enough to sit up at the kitchen table. We had tea. He was quieter than usual, and there was something deliberate in the quiet. "I've made things clear with Aldrich," he said eventually. I told him that was a good idea. He nodded once. "There's an envelope with your name on it. In the file. He'll know when to use it." I told him he didn't need to worry about any of that. He looked at me steadily. "I know I don't need to," he said. "That's the point. I'm doing it because I want to." I didn't ask what was in the envelope. I didn't ask what he'd arranged. It didn't occur to me that the envelope was what would happen in that conference room 9 months later, on a gray Thursday morning, when Mr. Aldrich spread a manila folder across the table and my father's hands went very still. Grandfather died in October. The practical matters, as they always do, arrived before the grief had finished. The meeting with Mr. Aldrich was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the funeral. My mother called the night before to tell me what time to be there. She did not suggest I sit with the family. She said, quite naturally, as though it were obvious, "You can wait in the reception area. This is mainly financial. We'll come out when it's done and let you know what was discussed." I said I would see her in the morning. I did not tell her that Aldrich had already called me separately the previous week and told me that my grandfather's instructions were specific. I was to be present for the entire meeting from the beginning, and I was to be seated in the room. I didn't tell her because part of me wanted to see what she would do when Aldrich said it himself. The offices of Whitfield and Aldrich were on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and photocopier toner. The reception area had chairs upholstered in a dull green fabric and a low table with financial magazines 3 months out of date. My mother was already there when I arrived, in a gray coat I recognized from the funeral, with her handbag held against her ribs like a shield. Daniel was beside her with his phone in his hand. He looked up when I came in, gave me a half nod, and went back to his screen. He had called me once since grandfather died, 3 days after, to ask if I knew whether grandfather had kept any of his old golf clubs because a friend of Daniel's collected them. My father was standing near the reception desk talking to the young woman behind it with the particular posture of a man who is accustomed to being the most important person in a room and is already recalibrating to make sure he still is. He turned when I walked in. "Good, you're here. We may as well all sit together while we wait." I said hello. I sat down. My mother straightened in her chair. Then Aldrich came out. He was a short man, precise in the way that accountants who have handled other people's money for decades often are. He wore half-moon glasses that he looked over rather than through, and carried a manila folder against his chest with the deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what was inside it. "Good morning," he said. "If you'll all follow me." My mother stood and put a light hand on my shoulder. "Clara, you wait here. We'll only be a few minutes." Aldrich looked at her over his glasses. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pause for effect. He said in the same even, factual tone, "Mrs. Whitfield, Clara is to be in the room." Your father was very specific. This was not a suggestion. My mother opened her mouth. "He wrote it into the instructions," Aldrich said, before she could. There was a silence. Not the dramatic kind. The small, flat kind that happens when a room has to realign around a sentence it wasn't expecting. My father looked at Aldrich. Daniel looked at my mother. My mother looked at the green upholstered chairs as though she was considering, for a half-second, whether there was any version of this she could manage differently. There wasn't. I followed Aldrich into the conference room. So did everyone else. The table was oval and pale wood. There were glasses of water already poured. Aldrich sat at the far end and placed the manila folder in front of him. My father sat to his left. My mother next to my father. Daniel across from them, beside me, though there was enough space between us that the seating felt like a sentence with a comma in the wrong place. Aldrich opened the folder. He did not make a speech. He said, "Before we discuss the estate itself, your grandfather asked me to read something. He was clear this comes first." My father made a small sound, not quite a word, the kind men like him make when they want to register impatience without technically objecting. Aldrich ignored it. He lifted a letter from the top of the folder. 3 pages, handwritten on the pale ivory paper grandfather used for personal correspondence. He put on his glasses, cleared his throat once, and began. "If Aldrich is reading this, then I am dead, which means I no longer have to be polite about what I have watched in this family for the last 22 years. I was polite for a long time. I was polite because I thought it might gradually produce change. It did not." My mother pressed her hands together in her lap. Aldrich continued. "Clara has been in this family what every family of this kind has, a person designated to make everything run smoothly so that no one else ever has to think about whether things are running smoothly. I have watched her serve meals she did not get to sit down and eat. I have watched her cancel her own plans to cover gaps created by her brother's carelessness. I have watched her carry the invisible labor of a household as though it were simply her nature, rather than a job assigned to her without her consent while everyone around her called it love." The room was extremely quiet. Daniel had put his phone on the table. My father had stopped looking at Aldrich and started looking at the table. My mother was completely still. "If my son objects to the word assigned," Aldrich read, "I would ask him to explain what other word applies when a child is given work to do that no one else is ever asked to do, for reasons that are never examined, simply because she was available and because it had always been that way." My father said, "This is not." Aldrich looked up. "I'd like to finish." Something in the flatness of his voice was more authoritative than volume would have been. My father closed his mouth. Aldrich turned the page. "I have known for some time about the money. I want to be precise about that because my son will try to frame it as a misunderstanding, and it was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision, made more than once. I did not know what money he was referring to.
Not yet.
I sat very still and let the letter carry me. When Clara was 16, I set aside a sum in a dedicated account for her education. Not for the family. Not as a general fund. For Clara, for the purpose I stated clearly in writing to my son at the time. Within 11 months, that account had been accessed. The money was redirected. I looked at my father. He did not look at me. His jaw was set in the particular way it set when he was deciding which version of events to commit to. I discovered this 4 years later. Aldrich continued, reading the letter word by word with a particular steadiness of someone who has been instructed not to rush this part. I said nothing because I wanted to be certain I was looking at what I thought I was looking at. I spent 2 years being certain. I was not mistaken. My mother made a small, aspirated sound, almost silent. The money did not go to a household emergency or a family crisis. It went to Daniel's first car, which my son told me had been purchased from savings. Daniel turned to look at my father. My father did not turn to look at anyone. There were other amounts over the years, smaller but consistent. I have given a full accounting to Aldrich, who has verified each transaction against the relevant records. I am not reporting this in a spirit of punishment. I am reporting it because Clara deserves to know what was taken from her, and from whom, and I will not let my death be the occasion for that truth to quietly disappear. The folder made a small sound as Aldrich turned another page. My hands were folded in my lap. I was thinking about the university I had not attended because the funding my grandfather had mentioned, once vaguely, had seemed to evaporate. I was thinking about the year I had deferred my own course applications to work full-time and help cover costs my parents described as temporary. I was thinking about the way temporary had lasted 3 years. I did not tell Clara during my lifetime because I was afraid of what it would do to the family structure, and I have spent the time since then being ashamed of that fear. It was cowardice dressed as caution. I should have said it when I could still say it in person. I am saying it now because saying it is better than the alternative, which is leaving it unsaid forever and letting Clara spend the rest of her life thinking the missing money was simply a misremembering, or that the opportunity simply hadn't materialized, or that she simply wasn't the kind of person things happened for. I felt something behind my eyes that I was not going to let arrive. Not here.
Not in front of them.
Aldrich kept reading. She is exactly the kind of person things should happen for. She has been practical and patient and uncomplaining in the face of conditions that would have made most people loud, and she has been all of those things not because they came naturally or because she had no other option, but because she was raised in an environment that systematically rewarded her for making herself smaller and punished her, in small, quiet ways, whenever she took up too much space. Daniel said, very quietly, "Dad." My father said nothing. "If Daniel is in that room," Aldrich read, and I watched my brother's shoulders tighten. "Then I want him to hear this also. Not to wound him. I do not believe he is a bad person. I believe he is a person who was given every comfort so consistently that he lost the ability to notice when that comfort was being built on his sister's labor. That is not innocence. That is a failure of attention, sustained over 22 years. Attention is a choice. He was old enough to make it long before he actually did." Daniel did not say anything. He was staring at the pale wood of the table. "My son will say I am being emotional," the letter continued. "My daughter-in-law will say she meant well. Both of these things may be true. They are also not the point. The point is what was done, not what was intended. Good intentions left invisible are indistinguishable from no intentions at all." My father finally looked up. His expression was the one he wore when he had been cornered and was deciding whether to pretend the corner wasn't there. "Dad did not have full context," he said, to no one in particular. Aldrich looked at him over his glasses. "He had the bank records," he said. Then he went back to the letter. "Before the estate is discussed, I have asked Aldrich to retrieve something from the lockbox in my study, which he has already done. There is a gray envelope inside a blue document wallet. On the front of the envelope, in my handwriting, it says Clara." My mother sat forward slightly. Aldrich reached into the folder and removed a blue document wallet. He opened it and took out a gray envelope. My name, in my grandfather's handwriting, slanting a little to the right the way it always did. He did not hand it to me. He held it in front of him and kept reading the letter. I am going to ask Aldrich to open that envelope himself and read what's inside before anything else happens in that room. This is deliberate. If your mother or I had opened it, Shirley would have found a way to manage the moment. I would like the moment to be unmanageable. Aldrich set the letter down, picked up the gray envelope, and broke the seal. The paper inside was typed, not handwritten. 2 pages. Single-spaced. At the top, summary of account, Whitfield Education Fund, established January 14th, year. And then in columns a full record.
Dates.
Amounts. Transfers.
Payees.
Every movement of money in and out of an account I had known existed only as a vague, hopeful thing my grandfather had mentioned when I was 15 and never mentioned again. The opening balance was substantial.
I had not known it was that much.
The closing balance, dated 11 months after the account was opened, was 0. Below the columns, in a handwritten note at the bottom of the second page, I verified these figures 3 times over 3 years. I kept this record because I suspected it might one day need to exist outside my own memory. It does. Aldrich turned the page toward me. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked at my father. Where did it go?
I said.
My voice was very level. That surprised me. My father opened his mouth. My mother put her hand on his arm. He closed his mouth. Daniel said to the table, I didn't know about this. I turned to look at him. What did you think paid for the car? He didn't answer. I hadn't expected him to. The worst lies in families are never the ones people tell out loud. They're the ones nobody asks questions about because the answers might require something to change. Aldrich picked the letter back up. I imagine by this point, he continued reading, my son has offered some explanation. He is good at explanations. He became good at them because I allowed explanations to substitute for accountability for too long. I am not making that accommodation today. The accounting speaks. If it requires interpretation, I would ask anyone in that room to consider which interpretation they would accept if the money had moved in the other direction. My father's face had gone a particular color. Not quite red. The color people go when they are calculating. There is one more item, Aldrich said. He reached into the folder again and removed a smaller envelope. On the outside, also in grandfather's handwriting, to be opened only if the above account summary has been disputed. Nobody disputed it. Aldrich set it to one side. He picked up the original letter and turned to the final page. I want to say something directly to Clara, and I want it said in front of the family because too many things in this family have been said to Clara privately and then denied when they became inconvenient. I pressed my teeth together. Clara, you were not difficult. You were not dramatic. You were not ungrateful or demanding or any of the other words used to describe girls who ask for fairness and don't receive it. You were 8 years old the first time you were given a job that was not yours to carry, and you carried it without complaint because you had already, at 8, learned that complaint cost more than endurance. That is not a character flaw. That is an adaptation. And it is one that you did not choose, and that I should have intervened in earlier than I did. I am sorry. I am telling you this in a room full of people because you've spent your entire life being told small truths in small rooms, and I want the record to be bigger than that. I closed my eyes for 2 seconds. That was all I allowed myself. When I opened them, my mother was crying. Quietly, with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the pale wood table. My father was looking at the window. Daniel was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face before. Not guilt exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that looked like the first uncomfortable steps toward understanding. Aldrich folded the letter carefully. The estate, he said. Now. He opened the second part of the folder. My grandfather had been, as I said, a careful man. His estate was not enormous, but it was solid. The house, an investment account, a pension payout, and a sum of cash savings held across 2 accounts. Specific charitable bequests first, Aldrich said. To the local library endowment, $5,000. To the Adult Literacy Foundation, he supported $10,000. To his former colleague, Mr. Warren, the mahogany bookcase from his study, as discussed separately. He turned a page. The house. My mother looked up. The property at Lantern Hill, Aldrich read, together with all contents not otherwise designated, shall pass in full to my granddaughter, Clara Whitfield. My mother made a sound. Not a word.
Just a sound.
My father said nothing. His jaw was doing the thing it did. Daniel said, "What?" "The investment account," Aldrich continued, without pausing, "shall also pass in full to Clara Whitfield. The cash savings, after the charitable bequests noted above, shall also pass in full to Clara Whitfield, with one exception." He reached into the folder. A final, smaller envelope. Daniel's name. My brother took it the way you take something you're not sure is safe. Inside was a short note and a cashier's check. The check was for £7,000. Daniel looked at it without speaking. Aldrich read the note. "Daniel, this is enough to rent a flat for 6 months and buy furniture that isn't assembled by someone else. Use the time to learn what it feels like to run a household without a woman running it around you. I love you. I hope you'll be worth it. Grandfather." Daniel put the check face down on the table. My father finally found his voice. "This is not," he stopped. Chose a different sentence. "She gave everything to Clara." "He," Aldrich said. "Your father." "And yes." "On the basis of a household account dispute. Of one redirected fund 20 years ago." Aldrich looked at him steadily. "On the basis of 22 years of documented choices," he said. "And a clear assessment of who in this family was treated as a person and who was treated as a resource." He closed the folder. "Your father was very precise about the distinction." My father stood up, then sat down again, then looked at me. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I had run out of things I needed to say. "There is one final instruction," Aldrich said. He opened the folder one last time. "If any beneficiary attempts to contest this will or to pressure Clara into private arrangements outside the legal process, the disputed share reverts entirely to the Adult Literacy Foundation." The language is watertight. I confirmed this with the barrister. He removed his glasses and set them on the folder. Your father confirmed it with the barrister also. He was thorough. He always was. The hallway outside Aldrich's office was long and carpeted in a shade of beige that had probably been optimistic in some previous decade. My mother caught up with me before I reached the lift. She put her hand on my arm, not demanding, just resting there.
"Clara," she said.
I stopped. I looked at her. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I didn't know he'd documented it like that," she said finally. I waited. I knew there had been some movement of money. "I thought it was, your father said it would be repaid." "It wasn't," I said. "No." She looked at her hands. "No, it wasn't." We stood there in the beige hallway. The lift arrived and the doors opened, and I did not get in yet. "I want to tell you I meant well," she said. "I know," I said. "But the letter said that's not the point." "It isn't." She nodded, once slowly. The way people nod when they are not agreeing with you, but acknowledging the truth of something they would strongly prefer not to acknowledge. "I confused you being capable with it being all right to need you," she said. "I think I did that for a long time." That sentence landed differently than I expected. Not because it was enough. It wasn't enough, not nearly, but because it was exact. She had found the exact word for it, which told me she had been in that beige hallway in her own mind for some time already, looking for it. "I know," I said again. Then the lift doors closed, and I waited for the next one, and went downstairs alone. I sat in my car in the car park for about 11 minutes before I started the engine. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but I didn't. There was something in the way the afternoon had gone that made tears feel like the wrong response, the way sometimes an outcome is too precise to be emotional about, because it is simply what was true all along, made legible. My grandfather had spent years watching. He had spent years writing things down. He had spent years being careful with a truth that my parents had spent years being careless with, and in the end, what he had done was hand the carelessness back to them in documented form, in a room they could not leave, read by a man who had no obligation to soften it. I thought about the afternoon at the kitchen sink, the potato, the gray window, the dinner that needed to be made. I thought about all the dinners. And then I started the engine and drove home. My father called 4 days later. Not to apologize. I had not expected him to apologize. Men who have spent decades being right about everything do not typically find their way to sorry in under a week. He called to say that grandfather had been in declining health for some time, and that the letter did not represent a fully considered view, and that the financial situation with the education account was more complicated than it appeared, and that he hoped I wasn't going to make decisions about the family going forward based on a very emotional document. I let him talk for several minutes. Then I said, I'm going to keep everything grandfather left me, and I'm not going to discuss the redistribution of any of it privately or otherwise. Those were his instructions, and I intend to respect them. There was a silence, the particular silence of a man recalculating. Clara, he said, be reasonable. I am being reasonable, I said. I've been reasonable my entire life. I'm just being reasonable in a different direction now. I hung up. Then I made a cup of tea and sat at my own kitchen table in my own flat, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I sat down before anything was finished. I left the dishes for after. Daniel texted 2 weeks later. Not about the money. Just a short message that said, I looked up the account. I didn't know where the money for the car came from. I should have asked more questions.
I'm sorry.
I looked at the text for a long time. Then I wrote back. Thank you for saying that. I did not say it was fine, because it wasn't fine, not exactly. But it was a beginning which was different from fine, and sometimes more valuable. He's learning to cook now. He told me this on the phone a month after the meeting, in the slightly defiant tone of someone who wants credit for a thing they know they should have been doing for years. I told him it was a good idea. He said he'd made scrambled eggs twice without disaster. I said that was a start. It is a start. I am holding that with some care. My mother wrote a letter 3 weeks after the meeting. A real letter, on paper in an envelope, the way she used to write thank you notes to people who had done things for the family. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I sat with it for most of that day before I opened it. It was 2 pages. She talked about the things she remembered. Not the things grandfather had documented, though they were there in the spaces between sentences, but the small moments she had apparently been returning to. The Saturday she had called me in from the garden to finish the ironing, because Daniel had friends coming over and his shirts needed to be pressed. The evening before my A-level exams, when she had asked me to help with a dinner party she was hosting, the logic being that I would already be up, and so the extra hour wouldn't matter. The way she had told people I was such a help and genuinely believed, while she was saying it, that this was a compliment. I think I was proud of you for coping, she wrote, near the bottom of the first page. But I understand now that I was the reason you had to. And I am not sure those 2 things can live in the same sentence, even though I kept them there for a very long time. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I folded the letter and put it in the top drawer of my desk, the one that had been grandfather's desk and was now mine, alongside his small card. The desk is yours. So is the time to sit at it. I have not replied to the letter yet. I am not sure I am ready to in the way that I want to reply, honestly, and without managing either of us through it. But I am also not close to it. I am leaving the drawer unlocked. That feels like enough for now. I moved into grandfather's house in the spring. I had not expected to feel what I felt, walking through those rooms. It was not grief exactly, though grief was there. It was something more like recognition, like being seen in a room the size of a house, by someone who was no longer there to see me, but had arranged the room very deliberately so that I would know he had. I moved the furniture in his study first. He had kept it arranged for his own working habits, and his working habits were not mine, and I figured he would have said that was precisely the point. I put his mahogany bookcase against a different wall and filled the shelves with my own books, not replacing his but mixing them, so that mine and his stood in the same row without either of them being primary. I kept his desk, that I kept exactly where it was. I found one more letter, not from Aldrich's folder, just a small card tucked into the top drawer of the desk, the kind you put inside a gift. It said, "The desk is yours. So is the time to sit at it." That was all.
I have been sitting at it. I still catch myself sometimes.
Standing in the kitchen while someone else is seated, with a dish in my hand that no one asked me to pick up. Starting a task before I finish thinking, because for so long the gap between noticing and doing had no space in it for me to exist. That kind of learning does not leave the body quickly. I don't think it ever fully leaves. But now when I notice myself standing when no one asked me to, I put the dish down. I sit down. I let the moment pass without filling it. That is what I am learning, slowly and imperfectly, to call mine. The moment before I do anything for anyone. The pause. The question I now ask, silently, before I reach for something that isn't my responsibility. That question is, who decided this was mine? And when the answer is nobody, which it sometimes is, I sit down anyway. I sit down and I stay seated, and I let that be enough. Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening. If that had happened to you, if a letter had been read out loud that named, in front of your whole family, exactly what had been taken from you and who had taken it, would you have wanted to leave the room before it was finished? Or would you have stayed, the way I did, and let every word land? And when it was over, when the accounting was done and the names were said out loud and there was nothing left to manage or soften, would you have taken the house? Or would you have given some of it back, just to make things easier between you? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, please like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.